3 unarmed black children were shot at this park in Detroit by police officers during the 1967 uprising. Meet Norman Lippitt, the defense attorney that got the officers acquitted of their crime and practically set the norm for making police untouchable in the United States.
Soulless.
See, on the 4th day of the riots, Detroit was completely burning. Lyndon B. Johnson was president at the time, and he sent federal troops into the city. Young soldiers that were sent in were heavily armed and trained for war. They had no idea how to do urban policing. There were rumors of snipers that spread throughout, and most of the reports obviously were determined to be false and just misinterpreted sounds later on. But at the time, it was perceived as a threat, and this is called sniper panic. The police and National Guard units would fire into buildings and windows and cars all over the town. At this point, the city was under curfew, and the officers responded to reports of gunfire at the Algiers Motel right outside the downtown area. Inside the annex were groups of teenagers. Police and soldiers entered the motel, and occupants were removed from rooms. They were beaten and lined up for interrogation. The things that happened would be more comparable to acts of torture than law enforcement. Simulated executions were used during interrogations. Individuals were threatened and questioned about weapons that were never found. 3 completely unarmed blackheads were killed at close range. It included Carl Cooper, who was 17, Fred Temple, who was only 18, and Aubrey Pollard, who was 19. There were no firearms recovered, and no sniper was ever identified. Officers were charged after details began coming out. So how did they get away with it? Well, Lippitt did not need to prove the officers were innocent. He just needed to prove that the details that they were giving weren't all true. The first thing he did was get all-white juries. At the time, lawyers could just remove jurors without any given reason. The result was that an all-white jury was deciding whether white officers were responsible for killing black teenagers. The next thing that Lippitt did was he moved the trial. Lippitt argued that these Detroit juries were too emotional because they just went through all the riots and seen all the media coverage. After that, he discredited the surviving witnesses. They testified about all the horrific things that they saw, like the beatings, the racial slurs, the mock executions, hearing all these gunshots, watching people get taken into rooms and just never returning out of them. But the problem was their memories differed slightly on timing and sequence, and Lippitt was able to use those inconsistencies to argue not that this didn't happen, but witnesses were a little unreliable and confused. The jurors were convinced that these small little imperfections meant dishonesty, and this created doubt. The next thing he did was frame the uprising itself as war. So Detroit being framed as a battlefield during that week also made it so the police were essentially soldiers under siege rather than public servants that were bound by civilian law. So that meant during war, extreme force can be justified. After that, we see the all or nothing trap. All or nothing meant the jurors were just given 2 choices. They could do first-degree murder or it could be acquittal. There was no manslaughter option. And normally juries can consider like a lesser charge of manslaughter, meaning it wasn't premeditated, but that middle ground was removed in this instance, and they had to decide on the all or nothing, so the officers were acquitted. Then things were brought up further and federal civil rights charges followed. The same exact strategy was used and that led to the same exact results. Lippitt later became an Oakland County Circuit Court judge. Historians have argued that these trials actually changed the power police officers hold over time. Police now learned that convictions were going to be unlikely for them, and prosecutors became hesitant. Black communities saw these courts fail to deliver accountability for things like that, and this case demonstrated how race-based jury construction and venue shifts, fear narratives, and a limited verdict option could produce acquittals without even breaking the law. And once the legal strategy is shown to work, it stops being the exception and it becomes the norm.
I don't necessarily disagree with him.